they probably understand that there will be kind of what we can call a residual hostility, because the U.S. has there are different reasons for that. I mean, there are probably historical reasons. A lot of people still call. I mean, recently I have seen some article when people were calling Russians like commies. I mean, like communist, and obviously this is back in time of 30 years or so, because definitely the Russians are not communist at all. They have a very similar social and economic system as we do in the West. So no reason. But this image, this perception of Russia as Soviet Union is still there. And when you see, for instance, a lot of explanation of the conflict in Ukraine, especially when you look at Western media, they look at the conflict exactly as they would look at the Soviet Union 30 years ago. This is the same rhetoric, the same explanation, the same ideas. I mean, this idea that this expansionist Russia, this expansionist, to reconstruct the Soviet Union, all that. And so the Russians understand that all these perceptions are there, and they will not get away so easily. But they also feel that the government, by the mere fact that the government wants to open a dialogue with Russia, it shows that there is some kind of rationality which is emerging in the US, and that even if you may not be best friends, but at least there is less hostility. When you start talking to people, that means that your hostility becomes measured, becomes rationalized somehow. So that can be explained. When you look at the figure about Ukraine, by and large, it's the same perception before than today. And that's the perception of the Russians about Ukraine. They feel that Ukraine is hostile, although people understand quite well in Russia that it's only a part of Ukraine which is hostile. And that's also important. I mean, if you compare the rhetoric or the narrative in Russia and in Ukraine, I'm talking about the official narrative. I'm not talking about the narrative in alternative media and things like this. But when you look at the official language, you will see that the Russian language is much more measured, much more reasonable than the Ukrainian one. I mean, in Ukraine, you go very quickly into a word that extremely how to say that, aggressive and offensive. While in Russia, but you remember that Russia has tried to maintain a diplomatic activity, not just towards Ukraine, but also towards the rest, the whole world, basically. And they kept a rhetoric which is measured. They are at war, so it's not, we cannot expect them to see that the Ukrainians are the best people of the world. But at the same time, they have a more measured language and less offensive than you may find in Ukraine. Remember that in Ukraine, they had to convince a part of the population that the Russians were bad people. Because in essence, in Ukraine, you have two different cultures. You have this Western Ukrainian culture, which derives from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is very Germanic in essence, which is quite hostile to Russia, Soviet Union, and everything which is Slav, basically. And this remains in the western part of the country. And when you see the Poles about different topics, especially when it comes to the relation between communities. And you see the polls in Ukraine itself. You see a decisive difference between the western part of the country and the eastern part of the country. Today, the eastern part of the country is clearly under a Russia occupation, or let's say part of the Russian territory even. But all the south, remember that in 2014, this is the whole south of the country that rebelled against the new non-elected authorities in February 2014. So you have this cultural hostility, and today the government in Kiev has still to convince the southern and eastern part of the country, which is left under the control, to convince them that the Russians are bad guys. So you will keep to have a very strong propaganda towards this. Now, when it comes to the three other countries, which are essentially the largest European countries, France, UK, and Germany, you see a decisive change in perception from the Russian part in the last year. Incidentally, this is the year, the 2025 is precisely the year in which Western countries have realized that their support to Ukraine has failed, that sanctions against Russia has failed. And you can see in the rhetoric of those leaders a more offensive, more let's say, extreme language. And for instance, in the 5th of March this year, Emmanuel Macron made an address to the French people, indicating very clearly that France was under the threat of a Russian invasion. And after this speech, you had an increase in the recruitment of soldiers. A lot of young French people enrolled in military programs and things like this. So meaning that the French people have taken this threat very seriously. But this came only in 2025. Before that, in 2022 also, what was the rhetoric in Europe? That Russia was weak, it will not be able to win over Ukraine, that Ukraine was much stronger, Ukraine was defending the interests of the West, and so Russia was not a threat, and therefore you needed to have a normal anti-Russian rhetoric. But now they have to go a step further, because Russia is winning in Ukraine. All the policies that were directed towards Russia have failed. Sanctions, you name it, and all the aspect also that, because there's a lot of things we talk always about sanctions, but you have to know that, for instance, in France, if you have a name that sounds like a Russian, a bank will refrain to let you open a bank account just because of your name, even if you have a French passport, even if you don't have double citizenship with Russia or whatever. So you see, there is here in France, you have this kind of obsession against Russia, which is very odd, because for decades, if not centuries, you had, after Napoleon, of course, but you had decades of friendship between Russia and Soviet Union, and Russia and France. Remember that you had a French pilot in the Russian or Soviet Air Force during World War II. You had a lot of connection, and even after after the revolution in 1917, a lot of Russians emigrated in France, and I know a lot of people who originate from that period. Their grandparents or grandparents immigrated in 1917. Even the word you probably know this word in French, which is bistrot, which is basically the equivalent of a pub, of a bar, bistrot. That comes from the Russian bistro. So a lot of words in French come from the Russian because you had this long friendship. And if you look at the French, the Russian language, you have a lot of words in Russian that comes from the French, because during centuries you had advisors, teachers, artists, and so on and so forth, who lived in Russia and influenced the culture. So the two cultures have a lot in commonalities, let's say. There are different cultures, but you have a lot of commonality. So this is, for a very long time, the Russians felt that the French were a friendly people. And today, especially after 2022, but especially after this, in the last year, the French made every effort to show their hostility against Russia. And this has become extremely harsh. I mean, in France, you have, just to show an example, which could be part of the clown world, because there is a Canadian dish which is called the poutine. I don't know exactly what it is. I think it's kind of a soup or thing like that. But to be honest, I don't know. But it's called the poutine, and it's Canadian, purely Canadian. Has nothing to do with Russia. And of course, you have some restaurants in France who are offering poutine, and those were stoned by people. And there was even attack with Molotov cocktails and things like this, because the restaurant was offering poutine for lunch or dinner. So that shows that this hostility. But in French, things may become extremely quickly emotional. There is, as opposed to the US, when we talk in the specialized literature, when we talk, even if you read the New York Times, Washington Post, or other mainstream media, which are strongly in favor of Ukraine, you may still have some sense of the reality sometimes. And in my different books, I quote very often those mainstream media, because even if they are in favor of Ukraine, they may have some facts that, in fact, they recognize that it can be something in favor of Russia. In France, don't even try to do that, because if you're against Russia, it's impossible to find in any mainstream media any sense of friendship towards Russia. Russia is the enemy, and period. And that reminds me a little bit when you look at the propaganda that you had in France during World War I, for instance, and World War II against the Germans. It's exactly the same thing. There is no nuances of the grays. It's black or white. There is nothing in between. And that probably is something that is resented in Russia as some kind of treason, because the relationship between Russia and France, and I'm not talking about the official relationships, I'm talking about the normal perception, the literature, all these kind of things. The two populations were very close. A lot of Russians speak French. For instance, if you go in Russia, a lot of people will speak French, and speak an impeccable French, by the way. So there's a sense of very deep friendship And what you see today, because all these actions, I mean, I described this restaurant who were stoned because of the Putin. It's not the government that decide this. This is the population. You see, meaning that we are changing the level here. When the government decides that we have this policy or sanction, this is a government.
But Colonel, does it show that the government is so effective in the way that they have forced or convinced the population by their rhetoric? They've been so successful in achieving that?
Well, to some extent, yes. But the thing is that there is a very strong censorship. A very strong censorship. And that's the same in Germany, for instance. In Germany, just as an example, my books, some libraries have acquired my books, for instance, and now the intelligence service, the Bundesamt für Verfassungsschutz, this is the, let's say, the modern Gestapo, literally. They impose in my books a notice saying that I'm pro-Russian or something like that. And this happens in German libraries today. This is exactly what the Germans did during World War II or before World War II, when they were burning literature that was not deemed as, let's say, in line with the government. Exactly the same thing. So we see that there are things that happen at the government level. In Germany, I'm not sure that what the government does has a very strong impact on the population. But in France, it has a very huge impact, also because the whole mainstream media is extremely polarized. And that underlines, by the way, the importance of alternative media to have some information, I mean, objective information about the conflict, because what we are witnessing today is that the whole narrative that was supported by the French government and the mainstream media were completely wrong, even false. I mean, that was disinformation, literally. And you had generals, French generals, who are paid by mainstream media to say things. I mean, just things that you wouldn't even dare as a researcher or as a journalist. I mean, honest journalist, you wouldn't allow this. I mean, just as an example, I talked to the journalist of a very important newspaper in France. It's a daily paper, and we had a private conversation on a phone. And he told me literally that his how to say that, the editor was preventing journalists to say the truth because that would mean they support Vladimir Putin. They prevent them to say the truth, use that word, because that would indicate that you support Vladimir Putin. That means that this is, when you hear that, that means that we are in a dynamics of disinformation, organized disinformation. And that's extremely strong in France. There are only very few media who dare to be in alternative. Otherwise, you may have issues with the tax administration, and there are all kind of pressures. This is extremely worrisome when you see that, because we are back to things that we didn't even had during World War II, during the Cold War. I mean, World War II, I'm a little bit too young, but for during the Cold War, the Communist Party existed in France during World War II. The Cold War in France. It was not prohibited. It even had ties with the Soviet Communist Party, by the way. So the censorship was much less important during the Cold War than it is today. But I think the explanation lies in the quality of the leadership, because the reason why we didn't need censorship during the Cold War is that because we were convinced we had the best system. I mean, essentially, Cold War was a war between two systems, the Marxist, communist. I mean, you can use the word you want for the Warsaw Pact and the communist bloc. And you had the more, let's say, liberal economic or free market type of society. And essentially, Cold War was a struggle between those two systems. And we were so convinced that our system was the best, then we didn't need a censorship. Because, in fact, the propaganda, and even communist propaganda, and you had communist propaganda, by the way, because as I already said in your show some weeks ago, in Paris or in Geneva, or you could buy the Pravda. I mean, it was not banned at all. You could buy those papers, Soviet papers, in the news outlets. So, but we were so convinced that our system was the best one that we didn't need to ban others. The problem is that today we are not so convinced that what we say is the best thing to say. And that's exactly why you need a censorship. And that's very true. As we said before, I mean, the economic system in Russia is definitely similar to the West, probably not in the same degree of sophistication. Maybe I'm not even able to assess that in detail, but in essence, we have the same approach to the society, the same approach to the market, the same approach to the industry and the relationships between inside the society, as you have in the West and in Russia. But
Carl, just you mentioned a very critical point right now. I just sorry for interrupting you, but you've mentioned the West went from being the dominant power going to right now to somehow, even within itself, the rhetoric is in minority one, and somehow is diminishing its position in the world. What has happened in the Western society that they went from such a strong position to the way that they are right now? What has happened within the society, within the leadership of the West, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, there's a lot of mismanagement that occurred in the last 40 years, let's say, 40, even 50 years. This idea, and probably Marxist people would call that some remnants of or variants of imperialism, but some others will call that mondialist or globalist approach of the world. But the fact is that in the West, and that's exactly, by the way, the problem Trump has, that the West has considered the rest of the world as their manufacturer area. So we decided that the cost of production has to be as low as possible. Therefore, we imported very cheap labor force. That's very true, for instance, in France, where essentially they have laid off the French workers and they have hired North African workforce, because those you can pay with significant less than the French ones. So you have, I don't know how many million of jobless people in France. And today, of course, with years, North Africans have been jobless as well. But initially, in the early 80s, those who were against immigration in France was not simply the right, it was also the left party. In fact, the Communist Party was against immigration because they said this is a way to lay off the French workers and to hire people that you pay with nothing. And
sorry for interrupting you again.
What?
I think this is a crucial point again that you're making. Whenever we talk about globalists, they're talking about these are leftists, Marxist globalists, but we have the capitalist globalists who
absolutely. Yes, absolutely. This is exactly, that's why for me those words don't mean much, because if you look at what happened, the capitalist part, and in the US you have the same thing. Basically it also explain why you had so much immigration from South America, but also explain why you had to outsource production of industrial products to China, India, and in the Southeast Asia, for instance, because basically we couldn't afford to produce and to pay for our own products in the West. And therefore, we had to distort our relationship with the rest of the world. Basically, it was some kind of colonialist approach where we are the consumers and they are the producers. That's in essence what happened. The problem with that is that in the last 15 years or so, you had those powers who emerged, namely China, but not only, just in the shadow of, not the shadow, because it's probably not very nice to say it so, but let's say behind China, not far away, you have India and other countries who will follow, meaning that slowly the rest of the world has learned about how to produce, and they also have learned how to innovate. They have learned how to develop a product. And today, when we talk about semiconductors, iPhones, and whatever, where is that designed? Where is that produced? For the iPhone, probably you can say, okay, it's still in Seattle in the US, but all the main components are designed and developed somewhere else, and namely in the rest of the world. Meaning that today, those areas that we considered as merely production areas are today those who can afford to pay for their own product. They are richer than us, basically, and they can confront us. And they say, well, if you consider us ourselves just as slaves, then we don't need to trade with you anymore. That's exactly what's happening between the US and China today. But in essence, the capacity of the West to have this position up to the end of the 20th century, the West was designing things, cars, watches, computers, cameras, you name it. Today, we are no longer the area where things are designed or produced. Our cameras are produced in Japan or in China. Our cars are produced in China and somewhere else in the world, and so on and so forth. So this relationship that we had between those who decide and those who execute, this has changed. Those who used to be those who executed the orders today are those who give the orders. And that's exactly the problem in which we are. And the problem is that we haven't identified this in the last 30 years. We realize this today, and in fact, that's exactly what Trump has realized. I'm not sure he has the right solutions for that. I'm not sure he has the right strategies for that. That's another topic. But he has realized this. Europe has not realized that yet. But internally, this has led to a lot of problems, because what we see in UK, I mean, those three countries where you have this changing perception toward Russia, by the way, France, UK, Germany, they have a very strong immigration population. And the problem is that this population today has no work anymore. I mean, I'm not saying that they're all jobless. It's not exactly the situation. But all these countries have a kind of second-class citizens that they are not able to provide with all the services that you used to be able to offer, let's say, 50 years ago. Meaning that you have societies that are less homogeneous, I mean, with a vanishing middle class somehow in those countries. It's very true in the US. It's less true in the West, in Western Europe, but it's coming. So we have this imbalance that is created in our countries, and we haven't really identified the problem. The problem is that we continue to have to import, if you allow me that word, we continue to import cheap labor from Africa and all, because again, we don't need to pay them. So it's some kind of colonialism. I mean, in the sense that previously we exploited raw material, you name it, iron, coal and whatever outside for production in the country. Today, it's not that. It's not raw material. It's workforce. Instead of having developed those countries, provided these countries with a production capability so that they could be partners today. That's exactly the reason why China has so good audience in Africa, for instance, because China came into these countries by assessing the problem differently. They don't want to take the workforce to China to work. On the contrary, they develop the infrastructures and the production capabilities in Africa, so that these countries can produce directly on the spot things that for their own consumption, but also for export. Meaning that in essence, you have kind of a sustainable development that is promoted by China, things that the West has never done. We may have in some areas like Tunisia or Algeria, France had some factories for Renault cars or for jeans or textile, but it was not really kind of a capability development or capacity development. It was more like we just outsource the production and that's it. But it's not linked with a developmental policy. As a result, we didn't promote the development of these countries. And today, these countries, when they need, I mean, the people of these countries, when they look for salary, they move to Europe instead of staying in their countries. The best things we could have done would be to help these countries to develop seriously, to have school, to have engineer schools in their country so that they can produce their own engineers, their own workers, their own production capabilities, and therefore they could be today our partners. But this is not what we have done. China is doing that, and that's the reason why the West becomes more and more isolated, because and I lived in two countries, namely Sudan and Kenya, which used to be the main strong points of the China presence in Africa at the time. And we could see that the Chinese were not there to influence politics and things like this. You never saw a Chinese anywhere. They were just used for what they were supposed to do: build roads, build a dam on the Nile River or things like that. And then these guys moved back to China. But the Chinese government never tried to take influence in local politics, try to bribe politicians and things like that. If you look at France, for instance, exactly the opposite. They try to influence the elections, and that's the reason why, by the way, they were expelled from Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, because the French were there not just with military presence, but they also tried to influence local politics and local economics, not for the sake of the development of these countries, but for the sake of the French industry. And I think that explains the reason why the West today is in a